Hello and welcome to the Stephen and Peter Sachs Museum at the Missouri Botanical Garden. I'm Neshka Pfeiffer, Museum Curator, and your host and moderator for the Grafting the Grape online program series, which is sponsored in partnership with the Missouri Humanities Council and with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Today's presentation, Archaeology of American Indigenous Peoples' Use of Grapes by Dr. Susan Kooiman, will begin shortly. This is the second presentation in the Grafting the Grape series, and we're very excited to have you join us. There are 6 presentations in this series, and they highlight content from the upcoming exhibition at the Sachs Museum called Grafting the Grape, American Grapevine Rootstock in Missouri and the World, which we hope will be open to the public later this summer. The previous event's recording is now available, and I'll drop a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in that to access that after this talk. We're able to offer accessibility features, including ASL interpretation for the deaf and hard of hearing and live captioning, which you can access via the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. To turn it off or for more options, you can click on that feature. A note about today's webinar, it will run approximately 1 hour and the presentation will last approximately 35 to 40 minutes with time at the end for a Q&A session. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to use the Q&A function in the box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll sort through your questions and get to as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. Today's program will also be recorded and posted on the Missouri Botanical Garden's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. I'm joining you from the Sachs Museum at the Garden, which I'd like to acknowledge is on the ancestral and occupied land of the Chickasaw Nation, Illini Tribe, Iowa Tribe, Kickapoo Tribe, Osage Nation, Oto Missouri Tribe, and the Quapaw Nation. We acknowledge the ongoing relationships these nations have with this land and urge non-native people to educate themselves about this history and about the contemporary work of tribal sovereignty within these nations. Through this acknowledgement, we honor the elders and their descendants of these indigenous nations in order to bring visibility to these long silenced histories while working toward a more just and equitable future. Our speaker today, Dr. Susan Kooiman, will be presenting on how prehistoric indigenous peoples of the Americas were using the native grapes and grapevines. Dr. Susan Kooiman is the assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. She's focused her past research on ancient indigenous pottery, cooking, and cuisine in the upper Great Lakes region of North America from 200 BC to 1600 AD, excuse me. She explores these topics using adhered and absorbed food residues associated with ceramic cooking vessels. And she's currently excavating a Middle, Woodland, and Mississippian site on the SIUE campus, where she plans to employ similar pottery analysis methods to explore past cuisine. Susan, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, and please take the floor.
Thank you, Neshka. I'm pleased to be here, and thanks to everybody who is attending the talk today. I'm really excited to talk to everyone at the Missouri Botanical Gardens and the Sachs Museum. This is outside of my normal audience, and so it's really, really fun to engage with a different kind of demographic than I usually do. And I got involved in this research project in a sort of roundabout way. And to be honest, I didn't really know that much about past indigenous grape use. And so being able to use my skills as an archaeological researcher has been really fun, and getting to know the literature on this topic has really been very interesting. And I'm happy to share it with you tonight. So I focus my own research on the archaeology of cuisine, of food and drink. And of course, that's what grapes and wine kind of fall under, right? And some of you may not be familiar with archaeology at all. So I wanted to provide you all with a definition. So what is archaeology? Sorry, we do not dig dinosaurs. No dinosaurs. That's paleontology. We're archaeology. Instead, archaeology is the study of past human societies using material culture. So what material culture is just things. Things from, I'll use my cursor, stone tools, Pottery, which is kind of my expertise. We look at things like this, like stains in the ground, that's where old house foundations were. Other stains in the house that indicate past storage units, storage features, pits, refuse holes, hearths or fire pits. We use a variety of materials to investigate people in the past, and that it would include actually buildings like this temple that I got to help excavate in Belize. This is a Maya temple a few years ago. That was a lot of fun. So we go from these very obvious evidences of past human society to things like small stone chips or broken pieces of pottery. That's most of what we're finding on the site I'm excavating here in Illinois right now, just little tiny pieces. And we use those pieces to piece together information about the past. Oops. So how specifically do we investigate diet in the past? And there are many methods that archaeologists use. So the first type of remains that we look at are macro remains. So these are remains that we can see with our eye. They're visible to the eye. They include floral remains like seeds, nutshell, wood, chunks of wood or charcoal, and then faunal remains, which include animal bones. So that gives us a hint at what people were eating. We also use micro remains. This is a more recent method that is being developed and improved all the time. Micro remains are microscopic. You can only see them under a microscope. And we look at micro remains from both plants and animals, but primarily plants. And then we actually use chemistry. This is really kind of a subset of archaeology that has really kind of exploded in the last 30 years or so. And we look at food residues. You can analyze food residues associated with cooking tools, pottery, grinding stones. We can use that to chemically analyze the composition of the food residues and again, kind of look at what people were cooking or processing in the past. And then, you know, the saying that you are what you eat is actually partially true. We do actually incorporate certain chemical elements of the foods that we eat into our bones. And so we can do chemical analyses of human skeletal remains to get an idea of past diet. We aren't really going to talk about these later too, the micro remains or chemistry too much. We will focus on macro remains for the most part in this talk. And you all are probably here because you are very interested in plants. This is the Missouri Botanical Gardens, right? And so the archaeological study of plants in the US and Canada is called Paleoethnobotany. It's a mouthful. In Europe, they shorten it a little bit and they call it archaeobotany. But we'll be talking about the work of paleoethnobotanists here working in the Midwest. And paleoethnobotanists use several lines of evidence of those macrobotanical plant remains, seeds, wood charcoal, nutshells. But they also more recently have been looking at microbotanical plant remains. These are little structures that are microscopic called phytoliths, starches, and then most of you are probably most familiar with pollen. Again, we're not going to talk too much about these. This is what macrobotanicals look like. So these are seeds. These are just a variety of seeds that I found on the internet from very high quality articles providing these really wonderful photographs. So you can see, even though these are macroscopic remains, you can see seeds in your hand with your eyes, but to look at the shape and identify these seeds by species, that really do have to be looked at under a microscope. So paleoethnobotanists spend a lot of time looking at seeds under a microscope, measuring, looking at these seeds and identifying them to species. You'll notice that in a lot of these seeds, they all look a little burnt. And that's because organic matter breaks down over time in the ground. So a lot of times most seeds in the archaeological record don't preserve. They're just like the leaves that rot in the fall and into the spring on your yard. Those seeds are going to go away. However, if they happen to be charred or carbonized through some sort of activity at an archaeological site, they will preserve. And so a lot of the seeds that we get preserved are carbonized. That makes it a little tricky for paleoethnobotanists to identify seeds sometimes because it can warp the shape. Part of it can chip off because they're more brittle. And so, paleoethnobotanists face a lot of challenges when they're doing this research. This is just to give you an idea of what microbotanicals look like. This is a whole other road. These are some starches and phytoliths from, I think, maize, squash, and wild rice, actually, from my good friend and colleague, Rebecca Albert. Unfortunately, there's only certain plants that produce identifiable microbotanicals that we find in food residues. So like I said, maize, wild rice, squash, beans, they produce microbotanicals that we can identify. As far as I am familiar, we don't have any microbotanicals for identifying grapes. So we're kind of limited to macrobotanicals. So what do we do with macrobotanicals? How do we collect them during the process of excavation? Now, when we're digging, we're often digging with little trowels or sometimes with shovels. And we might encounter large artifacts, but these artifacts are caked in dirt. And so they're a lot of times hard to see, or they're small, they're broken up in the ground. So we push all of our dirt through these 1/4-inch mesh screens, like my friend Kate is doing here in this photo. And that helps us find, if it pushes through the screen, it's dirt, right? If it doesn't, it's either an artifact or a rock. And sometimes it's hard to tell between the two. So that's how we collect a lot of our artifacts, at least in United States excavations. Now, a 1/4-inch mesh screen is still too small for seeds. Seeds are going to fall through that. And so a lot of excavations in the early 20th century, there's not a lot of plant evidence from those sites because they didn't have a way to really systematically collect plant seeds and look at what people were eating. That changed when flotation was invented. So flotation is a simple concept. You dump dirt into water and you collect the stuff that floats on the top, and that's the organic stuff. And that includes seeds. And so from what we call the light fraction, the stuff that floats, this is a very fancy contraption that we use. You can do this in buckets, barrels. There's all sorts of ways that archaeologists have done this. But you collect the light fraction, the fraction that floats, and then this is the fraction that paleoethnobotanists look at to find seeds. And here we go. Finally, we get to grapes, right? These are grape seeds. These are carbonized grape seeds. And these are from somewhere in Europe, but this just gives you an idea of what they look like coming from an archaeological context. And evidently, it is difficult to tell wild from domesticated grape seeds. And that's because with foods like maize, wheat, the food is the seed, right? And so when you domesticate a wild plant where the food is the seed, where you want those big seeds, so you're going to collect plants that have the bigger seeds. You're going to plant plants from those plants that have bigger seeds. Saying plant a lot. And so the seeds get bigger. So it can be kind of easy to tell wild, which usually has tiny little seeds, from domesticated. The opposite is true with fruit, right? Fruit's a little bit different. We usually don't like big seeds and fruit. So sometimes there's not a lot of change in seed size, and it can be difficult. So some researchers, Uchesu and colleagues, were able to identify some morphological or shape features of the shape of the seed and size features that can help paleoethnobotanists identify wild from domesticated grape seeds. And again, that's more of a topic that's of concern over in Europe and Asia, where they did domesticate grapes and had, vibrant wine culture. You can also look at, I mentioned chemistry earlier as a way to look at ancient diet and cuisine. And so they have identified certain chemical signatures for grapes and or wine. A lot of this work has been conducted by Patrick McGovern out of University of Pennsylvania. He's also known as the beer archaeologist. He really loves to look at the chemical composition of food residues and identify like recipes for ancient beers, ancient ales, wine. And so he and his colleagues were able to identify tartaric acid alongside some other elements, other acids in the residues of this lovely little pot here. It was found in Georgia, the country, not Georgia, the state. A very long tradition of winemaking in the nation of Georgia. And this is as old as 8,000 years old, 6,000 BC, that we have good evidence for production of wine. So very cool stuff. Unfortunately, no, not unfortunately. I know a lot of you are probably here because you love wine. I enjoy wine myself quite a bit. But there's not really a strong tradition of domestication, no evidence of domestication of grapes in Eastern North America. So they were, it appears as though indigenous people were eating wild grapes along with other fruits. It doesn't seem like they were really interested in domesticating fruits. There were plenty of wild fruits around to go around for everyone to eat. So that doesn't mean that people in Eastern North America didn't domesticate any plant species. They absolutely did. Some of you may be familiar with the Eastern Agricultural Complex. This is a group of native weeds that the ancient indigenous North Americans actually domesticated. This includes Chenopodium, which is a relative of quinoa, sunflower, a subspecies of squash called Cucurbita pipo ovifera, and then marsh elder. And so this is the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and people were heavily planting and cultivating and eating these species actually for thousands of years in a lot of parts of Eastern North America. When it comes to these wild species of grapes, moving back to grapes, it's really difficult and often impossible for paleoethnobotanists to distinguish these species from each other. Like I said, grapes often get, the seeds get warped a little bit when they're charred, and really the seeds themselves in different species don't look that different from each other. So most archaeological reports don't or can't report the species, and you just see reference to the genus Vitis. And the work that I'm referencing, I really have to give a shout out to all of these paleoethnobotanists who have done all the work. I'm just really taking everything that they did from various sources and condensing it and summarizing it for you. I'm not a paleoethnobotanist, but I work with a lot of them. They're wonderful people. So I wanted to shout out to Richard Yarnell, Gail Fritz, who just retired from University of Washington. Read her book, Feeding Cahokia. It's fantastic. Leela Lopinot, Margaret Scarry, Mary Simon, who's with the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, Katie Egan Bruhe, who's done a lot of work in the Upper Great Lakes, Katie Parker, Cecil Johannesson, Marge Schroeder, who's with the Illinois State Museum, and Connie Arzigian. So I am a Great Lakes archaeologist, so I'm going to start and just give you a really brief overview of this, just because, you know, I love the Upper Great Lakes. I'm talking about, you know, the northern Wisconsin, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, even into Ontario and northern Lower Michigan a little bit. And we'll talk also about the Upper Midwest in general, so going into Wisconsin, northern Illinois, Lower Michigan. The earliest evidence of grape use that I could personally find in the archaeological literature of grapes was at the Rock Hearth site in southwestern Michigan. This is from the late Archaic period, so as old as 3000 BC. It's very possible that there are older sites with grape evidence of grapes at them than, and I just didn't have access to those to those reports. Again, we see grape use in the next kind of archaeological era, which is called the early woodland period. The early woodland period is kind of distinct from the Archaic period in that this is the time when we see the appearance of pottery. Before that, people are not manufacturing and using pottery. And then we get, there's a lot more populated. There seems to be a bit of a population boom starting around 200 BC in the middle woodland period and extending into the late woodland period. And because of that, we have more sites. It's more recent, so there's better preservation. And so we just get a lot more evidence of grapes. It's not that people weren't using grapes as much in the past. We just don't have as much a good context for grape use. And I just want to note that a lot of the societies that we're talking about are hunter-gatherers. So particularly in the Archaic period and early woodland, a lot of these groups are mobile hunter-gatherers. They're traveling in bands of 20 to 30 people, and they're relying solely on wild foods, wild plants, and wild animals that they are hunting. Beginning a little bit in the Archaic period, but really taking off in the middle and late woodland periods, people begin to become horticulturalists. So this is part-time agriculture. They're gardening, or they do have kind of significant agricultural fields, but they're also still semi-reliant on wild foods. They're still gathering grapes, other wild berries. They're still hunting. They don't domesticate any animals in Eastern North America, so they're still hunting for all of their meat, and they're fishing. So that's what we're talking about, hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists for the most part. This is, I don't know if you can see it underneath, but my dissertation site is the Cloudman site. It's on Drummond Island over here in Lake Huron. And I was looking at other foods during my dissertation and was not really paying attention to some of the fruits. And so I was like, I wonder if there were grapes at my site way up north in the UP. And yep, I looked at the report that a paleoethnobotanists had done on the site like 15 years ago. And sure enough, there were grapes. There were wild grapes at my dissertation site. So I was really excited to see that. The Oneota people were, they kind of lived in these pockets all across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri. And these are horticulturalists, and they live kind of in the late pre-contact period. They have a lot of same traditions as the Mississippians. Some of you are probably more familiar with the Mississippians. They're the ones who occupied Cahokia. We'll get to that in a minute. They share a lot of cultural similarities to the Mississippians, but they're distinct. And there are grapes at pretty much like all the Oneota sites that I've saw reports on. They seem to really like grapes. And then the Huber people, who are horticulturalists living in kind of the modern day greater Chicago area. Also, they used wild grapes right alongside the Eastern Agricultural Complex crops. All right, let's get to what you guys are really interested in. Evidence for indigenous grape consumption right here in Missouri, Illinois, and a little bit of the greater Southeast. The oldest evidence that we have for grape use is that I could find is in Dust Cave, Alabama. This is a late Paleo-Indian period, so this is one of the earliest eras of occupation of North America by people. And so this is over 10,000 years ago. People are eating grapes. And we find these remains in caves are really good for preservation. Seeds will, if the cave is dry, seeds will preserve a really long time. So that's why we're getting such old information on this site. And they found wild grapes alongside other berries and nuts. In the Archaic period, there are sites across the Mid-South that have grapes in them, including the Phillips Springs site. The Phillips Springs site is here in southeastern Missouri, and it has the evidence for the earliest domesticated squash in eastern North America, domesticated right here. And so right along that domesticated squash, what do we get? We get grapes, so kind of fun. And more specifically in Missouri and Illinois, we have evidence for consistent wild grape consumption all throughout time, from 3000 BC up to, AD 400 and past. So there's just, most site reports they have a bunch of berries and nuts, and grapes are almost always part of it. Beginning, much like in the upper Great Lakes, down here in Illinois and Missouri, beginning in the late Woodland period and a little bit before, we get part-time agriculturalists. They're really going heavy on Eastern agricultural complex. Maize has come into North America, but these people around this area, they're like, we already got our domesticates. We're like, we're good on maize. They're just not picking up maize for some reason. But they're still eating wild foods, including grapes. Really long history. This is a kind of a fun site. So a late woodland site called Fish Lake site, which is over in the American Bottom, which is my side of the river, this floodplain over here on the eastern side of the Mississippi. There's a Fish Lake site, and they found burned grape seeds with adhered wrinkle skin. And so this is the first time that we have evidence for how they may have been preparing grapes. The authors of the report suggest that they may have been trying to dry the grapes over fire, make some raisins. They got a little too toasty and they got charred. So it was a little unsuccessful. But this is evidence that they weren't just eating them, raw and fresh, that they were also probably trying to dry them and preserve them for long-term storage. The Mississippian period. So this is probably what you guys are, if any of those you are, who are out there, you're probably most familiar with this. In the site of Cahokia. If you haven't wandered across the river yet into Collinsville, Illinois, go visit this site. It's really a great site. Mississippian period is, AD 900 to 1300. Cahokia is a city of 10 to 20,000 people. It is the ritual, spiritual, political center of the Mississippian world. At the center of Cahokia is this giant monk's mound. It's just really this giant earthen mound, and it's still there today. You can climb up it. It's really amazing. Now, right over here, there was a pit that was excavated, and they found actually 400 grape seeds. And they think that this was possibly Vitis estivali. So they think they had the species for this. And other kind of food remains were found in this just massive pit underneath what is now called Mound 51. And they think that this is refuse from feasting. So these grapes were part of this big kind of feasting event, or maybe multiple feasting events. And the food refuse got pushed into this pit. And then later this mound was built over top of it. So, grapes may have been a feasting food. Also, grapes were found on the east face of Monk's Mound, so right over here. Monk's Mound would have been kind of the center of the city, the political, religious center of the city, and also probably where the chief was living. So there's probably some sort of ceremonial use of grapes there too. They probably had some sort of spiritual significance if they were found on Monk's Mound. Now I want to clarify the difference between diet and cuisine. So diet are items or species that people ate. So we know that they were eating grapes. Okay. But to get more in depth about ancient culture, we really have to go deeper. We have to know ingredients and preparation, how they were preparing and cooking food. You can give people around the world beef and potatoes. They're the same ingredients, the same species, but they're going to cook them in completely different ways. Burger and fries, beef stew, all sorts of stuff. And so that preparation is a really key element to understanding past food culture. So archaeological evidence in Eastern North America has really been mostly a diet. We just know that the seeds are there, they're eating grapes, but we don't really know how they're preparing it, besides that one context where we found those burned grape skins. So how do we get at cuisine? The way that I generally approach it in my research is through ethnographic information. So this is stuff that was written down either by ethnographers working often in the early 20th century, studying these indigenous groups, living various places, or ethnohistoric accounts of early explorers writing down what they saw. And again, this is generally from the Western kind of Euro-American or European viewpoint, and not from the viewpoint of the indigenous peoples themselves. So again, there's not 100% accuracy on these reports. The Ujibwe, the Ujibwe, if you're not familiar, live up in Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and Michigan. And they were reported as using Vitis vulpina, also called Vitis cordifolia, aka frost grape, either raw or in jellies and jams. Huron Smith, he recorded that Vitis vulpina, and he said it was aka riverbank grapes, were used to make jelly for winter use after they frosted. So that does make sense that they would be vulpina, that frost grape, but he calls them riverbank grapes. The term riverbank grape is actually more commonly applied to Vitis riparia, which you guys, if you stick around for more of the talks and go to the exhibit, might know that this is one of the species that's now commonly used for rootstock in wine grapes in North America. If Vitis riparia is around, you can bet that they were using it, even if it wasn't recorded by ethnographers. The Ojibwe also would use the twigs and the sap of the grapevines as medicines. So it's a really interesting use of those plants as well, besides just for consumption. The Menominee and Ho-Chunk of modern-day Wisconsin, they also ate Vitis vulpina fresh, dried, turned it into jelly or jam. People have always loved grape jelly. It's delicious. And then they also use Vitis cinerea, which is gray bark grape, for similar uses. The Iroquoians of Ontario and Quebec. So you might be more familiar with the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy in New York. But there are other Iroquoian-speaking groups who lived here in Southern Ontario into Quebec. And that includes the Wendat, the Tino-and-Tate, the Neutral, and the St. Louis Iroquoians. And they had a very rich culinary tradition with all of their food ingredients. They had tons of recipes for corn, but they had some interesting uses of grapes. They would actually use grapes and berries and make these like condensed little cakes. And then when they wanted to make a sauce, they would just throw the cake into water and make a little sauce. So they were meal prepping. It was kind of fun. And then they would also use the bark of grapevines to make like a flour and make baked bread with it. So really inventive use of these foods. Some other ethnographic accounts. Nicholas Perrault, who's a famous explorer in Wisconsin, he took part in a calumet ceremony. This is a calumet. It's a kind of more colloquially known as a peace pipe. So he was doing a calumet ceremony with some people from the Sioux Nation. And during the ceremony, they gave him a dish of wild grapes and 3 times put some of the fruit in his mouth. So this tells us that there may have been a very spiritual or ideological significance to grapes to a lot of indigenous groups in the past. The Kickapoo who lived largely in northern and central Illinois, but also I think sometimes lived down in this part of Illinois that I'm in, Edwardsville. They were moved to Oklahoma, but when they were in Illinois, they were observed in the late 19th century making bread. So they're using wheat, which is, you know, a Western domesticate brought over from Asia and from Central Asia. And they were mixing with the wheat into the bread. They were using wild grapes, persimmons, and berries. So they were using their traditional wild fruit foods and mixing it into breads made with flours that they were probably getting from their Euro-American neighbors. And similarly at the Windrows site in northern Illinois, which is a Potawatomi village from the early 19th century, they found that grapes and other wild foods and native cultigens were actually some of the more common foodstuffs there. And this really is interpreted as signs of agency. This is indigenous people saying like, no, we're not going to eat your European food. We're going to hold on to our traditional foods. Even though it might be easier for us to just trade with you for that food, we're going to hold on to our traditions despite of everything and continue to hold on to our ways. And this was kind of seen as a culinary symbol of resistance to Euro-American colonization. So it's kind of interesting that wild grape was part of this. This is part of their identity, and it's a symbol of resistance. And people have asked me this in general, not just in reference to grapes, but people have asked me if there's evidence of fermentation by indigenous people. And really there isn't a lot of archaeological or ethnographic evidence for any type of fermentation, including fermentation of grapes and manufacture of wine in Eastern North America. No groups were really doing it when Europeans arrived. There's no records of that. There's not really any other strong evidence for it. But indigenous people had all sorts of teas and other drinks that had, they made something called black drink, which had like a ton of caffeine in it and kind of give you like a little bit of a buzz. And sometimes black drink would also include ingredients that had hallucinogenic material substances in them. And so, they had other things that they would use in their ceremonies that weren't just alcohol. They had their own traditions, their own recipes, their own strong histories. So there's just a rich history of indigenous everyday and ritual consumption of grapes. Grapes are abundant in the wilds and they're delicious, so why not? The thing that I did think was kind of funny, that it's the last thing I'll share here with you, is at a Mascoutin village in southwestern Wisconsin, Jacques Marquette, who also traveled through Illinois and I think probably Missouri, said that the savages, his words, not mine, have quantities of plums and grapes wherewith much wine could be made if desired. So as soon as Europeans got over here, they're like, where's the wine? Why aren't you guys making wine? And I think they kind of looked down on the indigenous communities for not producing wine. That's what civilized people did. You don't need wine for civilization. You don't need wine to be civilized. There's a rich history beyond that, outside of that. And really, what's the best way of looking at indigenous grape use? Honestly, to let indigenous people tell us about their own traditions and their own use of grapes in their modern cuisines. And, you know, archaeology and ethnographies can only tell us so much, but we can get a much more a deep and insightful views of grapes and grape use from indigenous people themselves. So this is wrong. It says June 19th, but it's actually July 19th. Don't miss Dr. Ian Thompson from the Choctaw Nation giving talk on Choctaw foodways and grapes. So you'll get a much deeper and better information about grape use from that. So don't miss that one. I'm also gonna, since you guys are plant enthusiasts out there, my colleague from SIUE, Dr. Julie Zimmerman, will be leading a nature culture hike at Cahokia this weekend, Saturday. And she knows tons about native plants that are native to Illinois and Missouri. And she just takes down a hike all around Cahokia and points them all out to you. So that's a fun event if you're interested in it. See the Cahokia website and events page for more details. And that's, you know, if you are interested in anthropology or SIUE, you know, here's our social media and contact information. So thank you so much. This was such a fun thing to research and be a part of. So if anyone has questions, let me know.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was fabulous. Perfect. Exactly. And what's amazing to me is how the huge breadth of information that you were able to share. And I also want to give Susan a massive shout out and thank you, because she actually provided quite a bit of this research that we were able to put into the exhibition too. So one day when we actually get to reopen the museum and you can learn a little bit more about some of these historic uses by indigenous peoples of grapes, I was really fascinated by how they were able to, the evidence was there that grapes were a resistance food. And that was really, that was kind of a unique story out of all of the things that we know about grapes, because it is very difficult to identify them as per the species and the seeds and so forth. And have you, I know this was you created this talk for us especially, but do you remember like coming across phyta seeds when you were at any other digs in the past?
No, so when it's really hard to see, it's almost impossible to see seeds when you're excavating any seeds, unless you get like a big old, like, you know, maize kernel or a charred bean or something. It's really difficult to see it. Again, things are caked in dirt, and sometimes you can't even tell if something's a rock or a piece of pottery. And so a lot of times when we take those flotation samples where we get most of our seeds, we are taking a sample of dirt directly from the ground. We aren't screening it. We are putting it straight in a bag. And then from that bag, then we dump it in some water and float it. And so a lot of times it's, I have very rarely come across any seeds during the act of excavation.
Gotcha.
It's only after we float these samples, as we call it, that we are actually able to find the seeds in those samples.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, because we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So I'm going to read one that's a little bit piggybacking on what you just explained, but goes a little bit further in terms of questions. How do grape seeds end up in these contexts? Do they always need to be charred to preserve? And other than specific possible raisin making, like the instance that you mentioned, how did these seeds get burned?
That's a great question. So I think I referenced Dust Cave in Alabama, northwestern Alabama, that has some of the oldest evidence of grapes in North America. So caves are really wonderful. We archaeologists like lose our minds when we find a cave that is dry, and because a lot of times that means that they have really good preservation. Things don't need to be carbonized if they're in a cave in the proper conditions. And so we can find all sorts of seeds. A lot of really great evidence about past diet has been found in cave contexts, because these are seeds that often aren't carbonized. How seeds do become carbonized is, you know, you're cooking, you're throwing things around the fire, or you're eating around the fire, and you drop the food remains in the hearth, the fire pit, and they get charred. that's typically what we think was probably going on. Just kind of like the food refuse after you're done eating it, kind of throwing it into the fire to burn up a little bit, or spilling while you're cooking or processing foods.
Gotcha. And so another question comes in: what evidence is there for use of grapevines in basketry?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And
Yeah.
I must confess that I do not know. I do not know that. I did find a reference. I don't know about basketry at all. I'm really sorry. But I do know that John Kelly, who also just retired from University of Washington University, he's done a lot of research at Cahokia as well. And I didn't include this in the presentation, and I'm not sure I submitted it to the stuff that I submitted to you either, Neshka. But there was evidence that they may have used grapevines. There's ethnographic evidence of them using grapevines as ways to kind of erect large wooden posts and poles.
No, yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I think I was like, oh, that's too far away from grapes and wine and stuff like that. So I didn't mention it, but they did use grapevines as they're obviously probably pretty strong. And so they were using them for ropes to do really heavy duty work at Cahokia and probably other Mississippian sites.
And I didn't get a chance to look this up really quickly, but I know that only one of the indigenous nations that we could find used, and I want to say it's a Cherokee, but I will stand to be corrected. They in fact use the vines as to create deer snares for hunting, because that's how tough those vines were. I mean, they're quite tough. So to capture an animal that would be as big as a deer, I think is pretty strong. So that, but we did not find any other things in terms of what we were looking for basketry either. But that was a great question. So thank you for that. I have another question here. Thanks so much for the great talk. This is super fascinating. Has anyone ever attempted to germinate the ancient grapevine seeds? And if so, was there any success?
I'm not super familiar. I mean, if they did, it was probably over in Europe. And, there's a lot of literature out there, and I haven't really kept up with all of the things about grapes and wine out there, but that's a really interesting thing to think about. We did, so I can't speak to whether anyone has done that with grapes. But I do know that people in North America have tried to re-sprout seeds found in archaeological contexts, and generally it hasn't been very successful. Just because it's just too old.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it hasn't been successful in other places. But I'm just not. There's a lot of archaeological research out there, and until I started researching this, I didn't know much about the archaeology of wine. So I was just kind of, I have kind of a skim level of knowledge on that. But that's a great question and really, really interesting. So yeah, something to look into.
Definitely. So it looks like this might be our final question. Where, and this is actually directly speaks to your own work, where is the site you are currently excavating on the SIUE campus, and is it possible to visit it?
Yes, it's the Gehring site, and it is on the western side of campus. It's actually not far from Cahokia Creek. And so it's possible, it's Mississippi, there's a Mississippian occupation. And so it's very possible that these were just a little farmstead, and that they may have actually been, growing corn, Eastern agricultural crops at this little farm, and sending some of it down the stream to Cahokia, because Cahokia Cahokia Creek ends at Cahokia. So yeah, it's a fun little site. If you get in touch with Neshka, you can, Neshka can give you my information, or you can look up my information on the SIU website and let me know, and you can coordinate a visit. We'll be excavating for the next 2 weeks until June 25th.
That's great. Thank you. And I've just dropped my email here at the garden in the chat. So please go ahead and email me. And also, like, if there's any other materials that anybody would like to request from Susan's talk, once we get the recording available on the YouTube channel, I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who participated or signed up today. And I can include links to all of that information as well. And so if we don't have any, it looks like we've exhausted all the questions, but Susan, this was a really thorough, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this and spending your evening with us today. And I'd like to make sure that everybody fills out the survey. I dropped that into the chat box several minutes ago. And our next talk is going to be in about 10 days or so on June 22nd at 1 p.m. And we're going to be actually visiting a vineyard virtually we're going to be going to Edgecliff in Potosi, Missouri, to meet with Steffi Littlefield and Cindy Kesey, who are vintners and viticulturists, and they're running their own vineyard and winery. And they, in fact, grow French-American hybrids and participate in the Missouri wine industry. So you can sign up for that chat. That I dropped the link to that talk in the chat as well. And Susan, thank you so much. Thanks to all the interpreters and the captioner for also this participating and sharing this event and making it accessible. And we hope that everybody will join us for the future talks in this series. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.